All right, so I got another story here for you guys on some of the rampant corruption and sort of wheeling and dealing within the United States Supreme Court. We obviously previously talked about Clarence Thomas taking some of those $500,000 super yacht trips around, I believe it was Southeast Asia, with the billionaire mega donor Harlan Crow, and now we have a new competitor entering the fray, and he goes by the name Samuel Alito, and there was this massive report that was just dropped by ProPublica in which they basically detailed this fishing trip, this luxury fishing trip that he took with to this resort with this billionaire, and basically they get into a lot of different various details about the history of it. The headline here is Justice Samuel Alito took luxury fishing vacation with GOP billionaire who he later had cases before the Supreme Court. Okay, I think a shorter way of saying this is that it was a conflict of interest. All right, now we're going to get to some of his defense of this, what I think is pretty brazen conflict of interest, right? I mean, you're going on luxury fishing trips with a billionaire who has even deeper connections than it indicates in this headline, and we'll get to that here in a second, but you're going on luxury trips that are all expenses paid with a billionaire who then is bringing cases before you that influence his bottom line, that influence his standing within the U.S. economy and political world, and we're expected to believe that you're somehow going to be completely impartial to those cases. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous, and these are the same motherfuckers on the Supreme Court, especially Clarence Thomas, but Samuel Alito as well, who have been like writing op-eds about how much of a disaster it is that the trust in the Supreme Court, that the legitimacy in the eyes of the public of the Supreme Court is going down recently, and it's like, you guys are doing this to yourselves. You are shooting yourselves in the foot repeatedly. Okay, so first I want to just get to some of his defenses here that he wrote, and then we'll get to more of the actual details and this hilarious aspect of this story, which is that he decided to write a Wall Street Journal op-ed before this original ProPublica piece even came out. He was like, I'm going to preemptively respond to a story that I have not even read in defense of myself. So pretty aggressive cope here, but let me just highlight one of the defenses he came up with. Here is pointed out by Leah Littman. He said, as for the flight on this private jet, Mr. Singer, the billionaire, and others had already made arrangements to fly to Alaska when I was invited shortly before the event, and when I was asked whether I would like to fly there in a seat that, as far as I'm aware, would have otherwise been vacant. Okay, he says, it was my understanding this would not impose any extra cost because I guess the seat on the private jet was empty and nobody else would have taken it. And he says, had I taken commercial flights, that would have imposed a substantial cost and inconvenience on the deputy U.S. Marshals who would have been required for security reasons to assist me. So basically he's saying like the seat was there, right? Not addressing the fact that it's a seat that was offered to him by a guy who has business before the Supreme Court. Okay, not just acknowledging any of that, but it was just a vacant private jet seat. What am I gonna do? I'm gonna leave it vacant? I mean, that honestly, he might be going woke here. Okay, my fellow producer over at BP, Griffin, pointed this out. Maybe he's just doing this for environmental reasons, right? Maybe he was like, well, listen, there's this incredibly, environmentally damaging private jet. I might as well, go ahead and get on it and make sure it's at full capacity. It's just for efficiency's sake, right? Maybe that's why he decided to get on the private jet. So just laughable defense of himself. But also it calls into question, like, why did the Wall Street Journal even let him do this or give him the platform to do this? Now, I don't mean like platforming him. Obviously, he's a Supreme Court justice. He could write anything, anywhere, and, a lot of news outlets are probably going to pick it up and talk about it. But he wrote an entire, opinionated piece where he is attacking ProPublica again before they even dropped their piece. Okay, so let's just go ahead and get into some of the information on this. They say, Supreme Court Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. took issue with questions raised by the investigative journalism outlet ProPublica about his travel with a politically active billionaire, and on Tuesday evening, he outlined his defense in an op-ed published by the Wall Street Journal. Yet Alito was, again, responding to a news story that they hadn't published, which means he hadn't even read it yet. He's going and attacking ProPublica over something he hasn't read yet just because he knows this is going to make him look bad, right? They say Alito's journal column bluntly headlined, this is the real headline, ProPublica misleads its readers. He's accusing them of like smearing him, basically. They say it was an unusual public venture by a Supreme Court justice into the highly opinionated realm of a newspaper editorial page, right? The same people who want us to believe, oh, we're just interpreting the Constitution in a literal sense, right? We're being, apolitical actors who are just determining the constitutionality of various decisions that we have to make. No, they are incredibly political actors. They, of course, throughout the entirety of American history have always been political actors with political agendas who will warp and interpret the Constitution in whatever way that they see fit in order to accomplish that political agenda. And it just so happens that a lot of that agenda that they do have is tied up with corporate influences and billionaire influences. Because, if there's one consistent thing about the Supreme Court, especially in the modern history of it, it's that they will always, pretty much always, okay, not 100%, but like 95% of the time, side with the interests of corporate America, okay? So they continue here. They say, it drew criticism late Tuesday for effectively leaking elements of ProPublica's still-in-progress journalism, trying to just undercut this piece, with the assistance of the journal's editorial page editors. They say an editor's note at the top of Alito's column said ProPublica reporters Justin Elliott and Josh Kaplan had sent questions to Alito last week and asked for response by Tuesday at noon. So he knew that this was when they were, presenting that they were going to actually publish this, right? They say the editor's note doesn't mention that ProPublica hadn't yet published the story, nor does it mention that Alito did not provide his answers directly to ProPublica. Just fantastic work over there at the Wall Street Journal, right? They say a spokesperson for the journal, whose editorial page operates independently from its newsroom, did not respond to the Washington Post request for comment late Tuesday, and ProPublica then published its story on Alito just before midnight, about 5 hours after the journal had posted Alito's column. And here's where it gets better. They say the article mentions, okay, so here's some of the actual details of what ProPublica was alleging, right? They say the article details the conservative justice's relationship with the billionaire hedge fund manager Paul Singer, including their trip to an Alaskan fishing resort in 2008. According to the story, Singer, whose hedge fund subsequently came before the court 10 times, not just like in one case where he was like sort of kind of tangentially connected to it, 10 times in cases involving business disputes, and that he flew Alito to the resort on his private jet, a trip that ProPublica reported would have cost Alito more than $100,000 one way if he had chartered the jet on his own. They say Alito, who wrote the landmark Dobbs decision that struck down federal abortion rights last year, didn't list the trip on his financial disclosure forms. An omission that some ethics experts say violates federal law. Okay, this is exactly what we saw with, Harlan Crow and Clarence Thomas. It's not even just that they're acting in corrupt ways, but then they're trying to cover it up, right? It's like a complete contradiction here, right? Either you think this was a perfectly legitimate case where you did absolutely nothing wrong, and so therefore you wouldn't be scared of reporting this information, right, on the actual forms for disclosure that you're supposed to, or you know that it was wrong, you know that there's undue influence there, you didn't recuse yourself in these cases, you were ruling on cases that were personally, financially beneficial to this man, okay, and so you covered it up and didn't report it on your disclosure forms because you knew that it looks like corruption, okay? Even if you want to say, okay, there's no, direct piece of evidence that we could say this is a 100% quid pro quo for any X decision that he made, but even just on the appearances of corruption, which again is something that they have all been worrying about because trust in the Supreme Court has bottomed out in the last couple of years for good reason, honestly. But there's just this contradiction here, right? You can't have it both ways. Either it was justified and you would have reported it because you wouldn't have been worrying about it, or it's not justified and that's why you covered it up. And I think it's pretty obvious which one it was, right? They say the article noted, okay, that the role of conservative judicial activist Leonard Leo is an important part of this in organizing the Alaska trip, including recruiting Singer to fly Alito into the lodge. They say the longtime head of the Federalist Society, which is basically what has gotten most of the most recent conservative Supreme Court justices on the court in the first place, right? So this guy, Leonard Leo, is the head of the Federalist Society and has been for years now, and he is recruiting this billionaire to go fly a Supreme Court justice on this trip, a billionaire who is politically active on the right. You can't get really more corrupt than this, right? They say Leo, obviously, helped Alito win confirmation to the Supreme Court, and Singer and the lodge's owner were major donors to the Federalist Society. So, I mean, look, do you see the just brazen circle jerk of corruption that's going on here between organizations like the Federalist Society, right? As they point out, the Federalist Society is getting donations from billionaires like this guy Singer, and then, oh, what do you know? Not only does the Federalist Society help to get Samuel Alito and other conservative justices onto the Supreme Court, but then he's also wheeling and dealing behind the scenes to push that billionaire to go treat you on luxury fishing vacations and giving you lodges to stay out. Same goes for Clarence Thomas on his yacht trips, right? Okay, so it's just like a triangle. It's like a love triangle of some of the most corrupt and demonic forces within the country. Okay, I mean, this is a guy who, again, is perfectly willing to go and strip away abortion rights. He's perfectly willing to go and try to dismantle the EPA and all of these other federal agencies to the detriment of the American people. Deeply unpopular decisions that have no basis whatsoever in actual, like, reading of the Constitution or what the American people want. And then these people get to stay in these positions of power and enjoy, you know, these luxury vacations and you know, a good life at the expense of all of us. I mean, honestly, we haven't seen any real progress in terms of like getting some legitimate checks on Supreme Court corruption like this, because again, they basically just get to do what like cops do a lot and just investigate themselves and then conclude, oh, well, we weren't acting in an improper manner because we said that we weren't. And I mean, they don't even have the same standards in place for the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, as they do for even lower courts. Lower courts have much more stringent accountability measures. The Supreme Court, for some reason, does not. So, I mean, there are pretty obvious steps that we could take. Okay, I mean, people have suggested expanding the Supreme Court. People have suggested putting term limits on Supreme Court justice members. I mean, there are a number of different things, but I think first step would be you have to enforce actual standards of accountability on these people, or they are never going to be able to regulate and protect this so-called sacred institution by themselves.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying